So the topic of my little presentation will be using these scientific field campaigns to learn about climate science. Again, my name is Vidal Salazar, and I work for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So before we get into what is really a scientific field campaign, you as a teacher, you understand that every research topic starts with a scientific theory, right? We need to understand what the concept that we want to communicate to the kids is all about. Try to understand the science behind it, the theory behind it, and then adapting these science and concepts to the observational phenomena that we want to transmit. We can talk about atmosphere. We can talk about atmosphere. Ocean interactions. We can talk about very specific topics like aerosols, chemistry of aerosols, how the aerosols are interacting with the clouds, and how the clouds are transforming these aerosols. All of these are basically just the scientific theory that we wanna relate. All of these concepts, they are quantifiable. For example, what the amount of CO2 is, was the production of CO2, was the and all these relationships that we're trying to measure, that's when we start putting together a little story about the relationship between these observations that we're trying to study. So, so what is really a scientific field campaign? A scientific field campaign is nothing more than a collection of measurements about the topic that we're trying to understand. In NCAR, we're very lucky to have lots of observational tools. In this case, we have the C-130, which is a lower atmosphere aircraft that is equipped with the latest in scientific instruments to measure anything that you want, anything from the chemistry of an aerosol to the cloud composition of a cloud particle. So we use these airplanes to get to the places that we want to do the in situ measurements. We have the G5, which is the top of the line, also atmospheric measurements, and we have smaller airplanes also like what this little one is, a BAE or something like that. So when we use this observational equipment, we can relate to the students a lot, and the students get really excited about, when we invite them to come and visit this aircraft, and they come to see how we're making these measurements. We also have radars that are used to study, again, atmospheric phenomena. We can try to understand hurricanes. We can try to understand tornadoes, how they form, how they dissipate. We try to understand, in the climate sense, we make observations in a longer period of time, trying to understand how the weather pattern change, how the rain moves from one place to another, trying to put a picture of how the climate is changing. We also use balloons that, these balloons can be meteorological balloons, and they can be also balloons that radiosondes that are dropped from these aircraft, and they take measurements as they come down. And again, everything is just to try to put a picture together of how the climate is. And all these resources are available, for any field campaign that we're doing. So we also have the meteorological phenomenon that we're trying to understand. We can do in situ observations. We can have the students observing all these phenomena that we want to study. And everything combined is basically what we use to investigate what we're actually looking at, our topic of how the atmosphere is changing, or whatever you're teaching in your class. So at this point is when you start seeing all these field campaigns that have a name, right? So basically these field campaigns are nothing but a collection of measurements by very specific instruments that give you an idea. For example, Vocals was a project in South America that was trying to understand ocean and cloud interactions. So there was a ship actually making measurements in the ocean, and there was several aircraft making cloud measurements. Vortex was a project that is actually goes on every year, and There's movies made about vortex. They're trying to understand the tornado genesis, like how the tornadoes are forming, how they dissipate. And Dynamo is a more long-term kind of a project that is trying to understand the monsoons in India. So just like that, there's millions of opportunities for you guys to grab onto. If you're teaching chemistry, you can grab into one of these projects that is studying chemistry. If you're teaching, atmosphere, grab one into that is doing more atmospheric measurements. Every single project, like I said, is a collection of measurements, and it can be as easy as just grabbing the data from the airplane, or as complicated as grabbing the data from the airplane and all the instruments that are inside. You can use that to create your educational and outreach components, or your the class homework that you want to produce to your kids, or etc. I think the opportunities are basically endless. But we're going to be using some data today from the field campaign HIPPO, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with HIPPO. But HIPPO was one of our projects that it had a lot of opportunities for outreach. The name HIPPO comes from the Hyper, which is our aircraft called the G5. It's a high altitude airplane, and it was an experiment that went from pole to pole, making basically atmospheric observations. They were trying to understand, gases that were man-made and how these gases were distributed throughout the globe. So HIPPO provided a lot of opportunities. Most of the motivation behind HIPPO was the lack of information about these man-made, human-induced global changes in the greenhouse gases. The airplane went basically from pole to pole, basically hoping into going from island to island, basically from 47,000 feet all the way to close to the ground, making observations. These observations were basically done by dragging either like air inside of the plane and analyzing it with the instruments, or by in situ measurements on the wings of the aircraft. And Alison is going to show you some plots about that. But we have a lot of data from HIPPO. A lot of the data that was collected for HIPPO was most of the atmospheric data, basically, and I'll show you some of the species that we measure. The aim of these measurements was trying to understand the sources and sinks of the atmospheric gases. We did profiles, like I said, from 47,000 feet to all the way to ground level, and to try to relate this to the climate history of these chemical species, we did the measurements at different seasons. And this is the aircraft that we use. As you can see, there's I think Alison has a better picture later on. But okay, so I'm talking about climate, but I just wanted to make the distinction between weather and climate. And I'm sure everybody knows weather here is basically one set of observations. How the weather is today: is sunny, is cold, what the temperature today is, maximum, minimums. That's weather. But when we talk about climate, we're trying to actually make it into a long-term observational period that we can actually discuss about how the temperature is changing, how the rain patterns are changing, how the distribution of these chemical species is changing. So this is what we're going to be trying to relate with the HIPPO projects. So HIPPO was measuring all these chemical species, and like I said, you as a teacher have access to all this information. If you're teaching chemistry, if you're teaching, how the climate change, everything that is available for HIPPO, you can use it in your classroom for homework or to your as a teaching aid. Some of the HIPPO. Something important to talk about also is for climate. It's very important to understand where you're making these measurements, and if you're making it at, what altitudes, in what parts of the world you're doing them. And this is better, for as an AI to understand what kind of measurements you're doing and how you're using this. And HIPPO was a perfect example for climate research, because it was they did 5 trips around the world trying to measure the changes in these chemicals, to use the data to understand the climate of the distribution of these gases. And this is just some examples of how the number of the hours that we flew, the number of data points that we have. So all this data is available for you to create your homework assignments or use it in your classroom. Some examples of the data that we produce during HIPPO. This is, for example, a curtain plot of carbon dioxide. This is just one season of HIPPO. It was just taken in January 2009. And you can see the distribution of HIPPO from the North Pole to the South Pole. And you can see the sort, where the CO2 is being created and when the CO2 is being consumed, basically. And we can go into different details, but I have this for the second campaign of HIPPO. The same, you can explain different points of this curtain plot by pointing at details like the sources of CO2, what was happening in the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere, and you can use this for your classroom. So so we collected a lot of data, but what can we do with that data, right? I mean, we can talk a little bit about models, but not that kind of models, of course, right? So we're talking about numerical models. So numerical models are not as sexy as that picture that we were looking at, but they're very important to try to understand climate. How we're going to be explaining these changes in your data. One day you were measuring 1 CO2, the next day you're measuring 2. So what happened there? You're trying to explain all this. So those numerical models are basically just a collection of equations that explain or try to explain the way the atmosphere works, or the way that chemical species that you are studying, or the transport of these chemicals. All these equations are put into one mathematical equation that will try to explain. So we use this data that we collect with the field campaigns to try to understand better how we we're trying, how the climate is related to the chemical species that we're trying to understand. I don't know if it makes any sense, but just to give you a general overview of that is, like, for example, in the numerical models, usually, not anymore, but a few years ago, people were using as a global CO2 average these measurements that were collected in Hawaii. They were using this number to represent the global CO2 concentration, and then they were making global models based on this concentration. However, one data point around the world doesn't really give you enough the distribution of actual CO2, and that's why plots like this one give you a better way or more tools to actually being able to explain in a mathematical sense how this CO2 is distributed around the world. And it gives you more tools to actually try to explain.
All right, so my name again is Alison Rockwell, and as we get going here, Becca is handing out a little brochure that kind of sums up essentially what I'm going to be talking about, and sums up the ways, or at least gets you going on the ways that you can use this information into your classrooms. So really, what we want to explain to you guys is, why do you want to use field campaigns in your classroom to learn about climate science? So there's it's really adventurous and exciting. We use these great, amazing instruments that Vidal was talking about. We've got airplanes. We go to exotic places and launch balloons. We launch them even from right in town in Boulder. We've got the Doppler on wheels truck. So it's a really great way to get your students excited about studying the atmosphere, is to show them that we've got all this great equipment that we can use. Students can relate to the different scientists in the field. We've got a ton of young, exciting people that they can relate to that are not that much older than them. If you're looking at high school students, these people are 4, 5, 6, 7 years older, but there's a lot of people that they can relate to. So it's not that they're just seeing, an older white male who's the scientist. So there's a lot of other faces that they can relate to. We use modern technology to get our point across: Facebook, Twitter, websites. We use Google Earth, as you've seen. There's a great amount of videos that we have posted up on YouTube. We have cutting-edge research technology like these. Like this Gulfstream 5 jet, which we have instruments all around the outside of it, so students can learn about the instrumentation. It's also a great place to learn about career development, because we have to design and develop a lot of the instrumentation. So we need a lot of engineers. We need aircraft technicians and mechanics to keep these instruments running, or the airplanes running. We've got this great C-130. This one's kind of the low and slow aircraft. The other one flies high and fast. We actually just recently won an award for our drop sonde technology, which a drop sonde is pretty much like a tennis ball canister filled with a computer panel that is collecting data, and it gets ejected out of the aircraft, and as it falls down to the ground, it collects data. And so that was, again, designed and developed in our lab, and we just recently won an award for that. We've got a huge S-pole radar, and we've got several radar, but this is kind of our big fancy pants one. This is a radar. This is a tower, and there's somebody up at the top of that tower hanging instruments off of the tower. So again, it's really exciting and adventurous, and it's outside. So these are different career opportunities that your students might be looking at and thinking, wow, I'd like to be doing that, rather than sitting in a desk job. So it's another angle that you can use for atmospheric science in your classroom. The Doppler on wheels truck. This one's been showcased in the Discovery Channel. Storm Chasers? That documentary, or call it a drama series, actually. That one's been in quite a bit. Another reason that your students might be interested in atmospheric science and/or our field projects is that there's now 7 billion people on the Earth, or somewhere around that number. So the atmosphere and the resulting effects of having 7 billion people on the planet is definitely going to be becoming a large concern, or should be a large concern for your students. Everyone can relate to climate science. So no matter who you are, where you are, you can relate to it in some way. Whether it be agriculture, or the food that you eat, or the food that can be grown in where you live, or how it affects the woolly bullies, or your pets at home. All these big snowstorms, it affects your dogs at home. And with climate change on the horizon, this is what we might be doing for our recreation. As Vidal was saying, that we do global field projects all over the world. So each one of these little icons is a field project. So on the actual Google Earth file, you can click on each one of those icons and get a little pop-up window with more information about the field project. But you can see we've done field projects all over the world since 1984. We've been out doing them. So one of them, again, that Vidal mentioned was called Dynamo. It stands for the Dynamics of the Madden-Julian Oscillation. I know it sounds like a mouthful, but it's essentially looking at climate and weather prediction. So it wasn't necessarily Al Roker's thing, but it's looking at a big something like the El Nino that happens in the Indian Ocean, and it has reverberating effects on different climate and weather all over the world. Another field project was called PREDICT, the Pre-Depression Investigation of Cloud Systems in the Tropics. So again, all of these, it's kind of like alphabet soup when you're looking at NCAR. Everything's an acronym. So, don't worry about it if you don't know what they are. It's okay. But this study looked at storms developing off of the west coast of Africa and why some storms develop into hurricanes and why other ones don't. So it was looking at the environmental conditions about that. But hurricanes affect everyone. This study will hopefully have be able to provide people with a longer lead time on getting prepared for hurricanes. So again, this climate and weather study affects everyone. This is a hurricane evacuation picture. So again, just trying to give people a longer lead time to get out of Dodge. Another one is we had to understand what bunnies have to do with atmospheric science, cute little furry bunnies. But it has to do with a rabbit-proof fence that's in southwestern Australia. And it was called Buffex. And so there's a bunny fence or rabbit fence. It's the longest fence in the world that is a fence between farmland and native shrubland. And there were clouds happening and forming over the natural shrubland, but not over the farmland. And the farmers kept thinking, well, if the clouds are over there, we want our farmland over there. So let's push the bunny fence out and then we'll get to the clouds, and then it'll water our crops better. But the study found out that there really is a disruption in the atmosphere above the farmland versus over the native scrubland. So there was actually a natural process that was taking place there. So they were not allowed to push the fence out and farm on the other side of the fence. So here's just another picture of one of the aircraft that was taking measurements that you can clearly see the line of scrubland over or versus the farmland. And back to HIPPO, the Hyper Pole-to-Pole Observations Field Campaign. Okay, so we've got a field projects website. So this is for outreach specifically. So this is so this is run by EOL, and it showcases the most recent field projects that we've done that we actually have outreach materials for, and it's all on the handout that we just gave to you guys. So it's the first link on the back page. So here's our Earth Observing Laboratory Facebook page. It's has many updates each week, but again, it's just trying to tap into those resources that younger generations use. Although I was just at a poster session this morning, and I was talking with an older gentleman who pulled out his iPad and was all excited about Facebook, and I showed him this page, and he liked it. So it's really not just your young students who are using Facebook and who find it interesting, but it's just a new way to keep up with different things that are going on in the world. So we've got an EOL Facebook page. We're also on Twitter, so you and your students can follow along with Twitter as well, and then YouTube. And then there's also a YouTube channel, and there's upwards of 40 different videos on here. A lot of them are based a lot of them are focused on field projects. So you can go here, and some of them are just something real simple that young students can understand, up to higher technical, science-y videos that are really explaining the science behind it, again, even at different levels. But some of them are just kind of pretty pictures like this with some captions that give it a little more information. So so those are our resources. The handout that I gave to you guys explains generally the overview of what I just did. And again, these resources can be used in just about any high school level class or middle school class, English, literature, poli-sci, biology, chemistry, the standard science ones as well.
So it's just going to play. All right, so I teach high school students, mainly biology and AP environmental science, and so I spent a month working with the scientists as well as the outreach program, talking to them and learning from scientists about how to use this data actually in my classroom. There were 12 teachers that were selected from across our state, and we worked together in a team, and we created our own web page, which is available to you. I think Becca's going to hand out a little card. It's got our website as well as links to all of the teachers and all of the curriculum that we created. So in addition to what we're offering today, if you get on there, there's a lot more other resources that you can thumb through. They range from modeling activities in a middle school all the way up to a high school AP class. So they vary in range and in complexity, but most of them are pick it up, pack it, from start to finish. So it's kind of one of those time savers that I know I need in a classroom, whereas I don't have to sit down and look through the data and sort it out myself. It's been done for me. So from there, I'm going to take the curtain plots that we were introduced to today, and I'm going to walk you through a quick lesson. I use an inquiry base, so a 5 E's lesson plan, so engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. I'm going to smush it into a quick time period. I work in a block system, so 90 minutes. I'm going to do it in a block and a half. So why would I use this in my classroom, first of all? Well, I teach my AP Environmental and my biology students that they need to be scientists. They need to look at the data for themselves. They need to become and interpret and spend the time actually looking at the information rather than me giving them a beautiful data set that works out perfectly every time. I want them to get frustrated, I want them to ask questions, and I want them to come up with their own interpretations and then compare it to what information is available. Rather than questioning me, they get to question themselves and the data that's presented. Works a lot better for me. Plus, it's kind of neat to see what's available. I think Alison made the point that HIPPO's pretty interesting. The kids get to watch a beautiful aircraft and scientists do their work, and it isn't the typical white male lab coat kind of guy. So I think they're passing out the resources. You are going to get the lesson plan at hand. It kind of breaks down each activity. I would start out with my students by asking, so what gases exist in the atmosphere? I'm going to get the common ones. Well, ozone, we've got some carbon dioxide. Someone might come up with methane. I'm going to say, but how do you know that? And they're going to look at me for a while, and they're like, I don't know. Well, how do you know that? What kind of instrumentation, what measurements do we have? So eventually we'll come to this conclusion that somehow we have to gather data. And in this case, I'm going to use my HIPPO data that is available to me and available to you guys to tell them how am I gathering data. On the YouTube site, Steve talks about how this aircraft flies and how they gather each set of instrumentation and how they're gathering the information. So it's kind of nice. I don't have to do any of the explanation. You guys kind of got an overview, so I'm going to spare you the 1 minute clip, and we'll get into the activity instead. So you should have a graph. You will have a graph. And you've got some stickies. There's a large sticky and a small sticky. All right, I think we're ready to move on. So you're going to need to take the small sticky, and in order to save paper and color printing, I don't have an endless budget like most teachers. So I copy one class set of my colored graphs, and I use stickies to help prove my point. So on the small sticky, all you're doing is creating observations. We call this a what I see moment. So on the small stickies, you pick one graph, doesn't matter which graph you want to look at, but pick one of the CO2 plots, HIPPO 1 or HIPPO 2, and all you're doing is on each sticky, you are writing what you see. It's fact-based. I should be able not to argue with you because you wrote something that you see. I might write on my sticky, I see that latitude is something that is measured. So I'm going to give you a moment. This is all by your lonesome. You'll have an opportunity to talk to your neighbor momentarily. But make several observations and put that sticky right down on your graph. All right, what I'd like you to do now is at your table, each of you gets to look at each other's what I sees. So go ahead and share what observations, what things you are seeing on your graph. All right, at this point, I hope you've had an opportunity to talk and share, and just as my students do, look at the graph and figure out the variables and the things that you understand and the things that maybe you still have questions on. So, at this point, I'd like to give you a quick scientific explanation.
This is a colored graph that actually summarizes some of the most interesting results from the first HIPPO flight program. It's showing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as you would take a slice down the middle of the atmosphere from the North Pole on the right-hand side to the South Pole on the left-hand side, and from the surface up to about 14,000 meters or about 40-some thousand feet. What you see there is in the northern hemisphere there's more CO2 than there is in the southern hemisphere at this time of year. And you also can see that the atmosphere has moved these gradients in such a way that you can see a lot of contrast as you move horizontally, but very little contrast in the vertical direction. So the atmosphere has really stirred stuff up from the surface up into the middle part of the atmosphere. One of the things we wanted to learn from HIPPO was just how efficient that process is. It's been kind of a subject of debate, and we can see here that it's quite efficient, at least at this time of year. Another thing that's really interesting, if you look on the lower left-hand side of the figure, you see kind of extraordinarily low concentrations of CO2. That's because during the summertime in the cold waters of the Antarctic, there are very intense blooms of phytoplankton and little green organisms in the ocean, and they're sucking CO2 out of the ocean and out of the atmosphere in order to make their green parts, just like any plant does.
So that's a short clip that is accessible from the YouTube. It's from the HIPPO campaign. It's Steve talking about the CO2 graph. He's got others on there. I left you some resources from other links. I probably wouldn't show my students the CO2 graph. I would show them the methane graph, because the next activity on the larger sticky, so what I'd like you to do is write what it means. You have a little bit of information. So he gave you a little bit of explanation. So you might have a data point. I want you to look at that data point, and it says, hopefully, I see a red point. And because remember, this is a three-dimensional but on a two-dimensional surface, the zero line points to the equator, the positive is the northern hemisphere, the negative is the southern hemisphere, and the altitude goes up. So you've got to kind of envision this like a box rather than a flat surface to really get the full effect. So I might say I see a high concentration of CO2 in the North Pole in the lower altitudes, would be one of my observations if I were looking at the January 2009 graph. Now, I'm going to put some meaning to it. It's my best interpretation. I know it's maybe not 100% right. We will continue to process this as a whole class. So on the big sticky, what do you think it means? What does that data point mean? It's the explanation part. And you can go ahead and put the big sticky right underneath the little sticky so that they are paired together. So at this point, my students would have lots of questions just like you all have generated. And we'd sit down and we'd have a debrief of what the graph looks like. I'd probably pick another Steve video to show, and he'd do a really nice job of explaining what everything means. Many of you figured out that we're measuring a curtain like a shower curtain from the bottom of the ocean all the way up. Sorry, the top of the water all the way up. But like a curtain, and it's from pole to pole. This happened in many different flights to gather this information. You can see that the white line is helping you plot where the plane actually flew. After we'd sit and talk about this for a moment, we might discuss some of the limitations of this data because it isn't perfect data. Just like real science, there are limitations. This is a flight pattern. Some of the flight patterns didn't repeat themselves perfectly. But it brings us to, well, why are they different? Why do we have varying levels of CO2 in our atmosphere? And so I would take my students down a road of source and sink. So source being where is the carbon coming from, and sink, where is it going? So there's an activity if you want to follow down the lesson that would help students to figure out where all the carbon is coming from and where is it all going. So we all teach the carbon cycle, but beyond the carbon cycle, we need to discuss how's this carbon continuing to move into our atmosphere, and where does it come out, and can we sustain these levels? So carbon source and sink activity is included. There's also then a map for your students to help visually represent where the carbon comes from, where the carbon goes. There's links to other websites that can provide you with that background information if you're not familiar with it, as well as an evaluation question that talks about fire and production of CO2 and how that would impact a curtain plot. I don't know if you have further questions beyond that, but I'm going to probably turn it over for another activity.
Okay, so the next activity we're going to do is about, what is a model, and it's about how scientists might use this data. Your students, if you're going to do a curtain plot activity, you're talking about data, but what's happening next? They've gathered all this data. How are they analyzing it? And Vidal mentioned earlier the idea of numerical modeling. And that's one thing that scientists do once they've collected current observations, is then they do models. But students have a hard time conceiving of what a model is. So we're going to actually do an activity that helps us understand a model. So it's going to require a little bit of shifting. We need groups of 4 people. So if a couple of you have tables with groups of 4. If you are missing one, somebody who's the 5th at a table, if you could go find a different group. And then you should have a bag of wooden poker chips at your table. Each of you gets one of those little mini baggies in there. And if you don't have a bag of the poker chips, then let Sarah know and she'll pass them out to you. Alison's passing out the handout. It's 3-hole punch, so you can put it in your binder for this activity. Okay, so you're getting some laminated cards. There are only 3 of them. Keep them in order. So basically, a good way to do this activity is to have everyone in a row. These tables aren't as conducive for that. So you just want to do it in a semicircle or something to have your order. The first person takes the Earth card. The second person takes the lower atmosphere card. The third person takes the upper atmosphere card. And the fourth person represents space, and you don't have a laminated card. Okay, so I'm going to give you some background information about this activity once we're all set up. This takes a little bit of setup. So each of you take your cards, open up a baggie with your 20 wooden chips, and fill your card from the bottom up with chips. The person that is space, just make a pile of the wooden chips in front of you. So for people who might have missed it, you're going to set up your cards with your 20 chips from the bottom up, filling each square. But over on the right side of the graph, or the graphic, you can see what's happening with temperature as we go up in the atmosphere. So that's important to what's happening in this activity. That's what we're modeling, is temperature. So this one simplifies it and just shows the troposphere and the stratosphere. And here's a photo of the different layers of the atmosphere and what they look like. Okay, so we're going to do the activity together for the first couple of rounds. The instructions in the handout you received tell you that you're going to do 10 runs of this model run. But for simplicity's sake, we've learned that facilitating it together works a lot better for the first couple of rounds so everyone gets it down. And I think it would be even more important to do that with your students before you set them free. So the first thing you're going to do is transfer chips to each other all at once. So don't do this yet. I'm going to explain this. Based on how many you have on your card. So if you all have 20, the number you're looking at, it's hard for me to hold this microphone and do this. It's whatever the next blank square is above or next to your last chip. So is that 4 for everybody, Randy? It's 4? So for this round, if you have the Earth card, you're only going to be transferring chips to the lower atmosphere. If you have the lower atmosphere card, you're going to be transferring 4 chips each to Earth and the upper atmosphere. If you have the upper atmosphere, you're going to be transferring 4 each to the lower atmosphere and to space. And space always transfers, is it 3, Randy? I'm now blinking. Space always transfers 3 to Earth. So the way we do this is you kind of stage it. So everybody, depending on which place you are, on these arrows at the top left and right of the card, stage your 4 that you're supposed to transfer Make sure everyone in your group is ready. 3 if it's space, but otherwise 4 for everyone else. When everybody's ready, transfer your chips to the appropriate places and then fill back up your card up towards the top with how many you have. And then we'll see how everyone did. Photo up on the screens of what your cards should look like after the first round. Okay, so we're going to do the second round. Pick the number based on where you are. So based on this, Earth is still transferring 4. The lower atmosphere is going up to the next one above, which is 4. And the upper atmosphere is only transferring 3 this time. So stage the chips that you're transferring. Space, you still transfer 3 back to Earth. So stage it, and then everyone do the transfer at once. Okay, raise your hand if you have not completed round 2 yet. Okay, we might be getting off on numbers a little bit, but your cards should look something like the picture up here as far as the Earth is getting hotter, the upper atmosphere is getting significantly cooler compared to Earth. Does everyone have a good enough sense of how to do this to do a couple more rounds on your own? Okay, go ahead and do 4 more rounds on your own, and then we'll come back together and discuss what's happening. So do 4 more model runs. Okay, if I could get everyone's attention up this way, please. So this picture up here is what happened after 4 runs when we did it, and then it seems to keep going and kind of stabilize out where your cards should look something like this as far as proportions of chips, not necessarily this exact same number. So based on the diagrams we had of what's happening with temperature in the atmosphere, how does this compare? And what thoughts do you have on what's working about this and what isn't? Any thoughts? Yeah. Okay, so one thing, I guess what I meant by stabilize is that for a number of runs, you start to find that everyone's doing the same numbers of things. But yeah, so is that going to be accurate in this thing to have space run out of energy? No. Other thoughts about this? So what if we added in that it became nighttime? Is it accurate to do it the way we have been doing it, or would you make a change in how things are transferring? Space wouldn't be giving out, but would anything be going to space? How half of the Earth is at daytime when half of the Earth is at nighttime, so that might equal out. But basically at this point, what you'd want to do with your students is have a conversation about what you might adjust in this model. Would you have Earth always get some, or space always get some things from the upper atmosphere, like 1 or 2 each time, so that space isn't depleted completely? So you could play around with it. So the last thought I'll leave you with, you may have heard this before, is this quote that all models are wrong and some are useful. So you can keep this in mind when you're talking to your students about what students are doing with models too, and they have purposes for it. One of the reasons we included this in this topic is that we've been talking about how scientists study climate, and field campaigns are one of the ways that they're collecting data, and then something has to happen with the data. But we're looking at this suite of resources as a way to understand how we know and how scientists know what they know, to have confidence in what scientists are learning about the climate. So we have a bunch of bookmarks. If you didn't get them from Randy during the share-a-thon, we'll pass them around. It's where our resources will live on the web, so you can find all that information. And I think it's time for us to wrap up, so thank you.